Alright, this is an introduction to the brain. This is a picture my nephew drew when he was maybe 5 or 6. And it kind of just shows that we have this image of our brain from an early age, kind of showing that it's divided up into lobes and that these lobes serve particular functions. And he's got it pretty close. I mean, you can see here he might have his lobes a little mixed up in terms of their location. This is your frontal lobe in the red and orange here. The yellow and green is your parietal lobe. This darker green and blue is your occipital lobe and your temporal lobe, just like the names of the skulls in the, or the bones in the skull. And then of course you have your cerebellum down at the bottom here, and your brainstem. So we're going to look at these different regions of the brain and what their role is, and as well as some special features that you see in the brain, and kind of talk about brain function and different lobes of the, or different sides of the brain and what they can do for us as well. So as you can see here, there's a lot of divisions in the brain. One thing I'm going to point out in a minute is the difference between kind of a primary area. So here, this is your primary visual area versus your visual association area. And so this might be where information about my vision enters my brain, like simply just the actual sight. But to recognize what I'm looking at, I'd have to use a different region of the brain. And then we'll talk about the other regions of the brain that you would need to maybe speak about what you're seeing, and regions of the brain to move the actual muscles, moving your lips and so forth. So there are 4 major regions of the brain. We've talked about these a little bit. Your cerebrum, which is your conscious brain. This is a new term, the diencephalon. Ceph just kind of refers to head. Diencephalon is kind of like the inside region of the brain. You can't really see these from the outside, but we'll talk about the function of your thalamus and hypothalamus. We don't really talk about the epithalamus much because we talk about the specific structures we find there instead. Trying to eliminate a couple vocab terms. The brainstem, which does a lot of your vital functions through your midbrain pons and medulla, and your cerebellum. So we'll dive into these all a little bit deeper. So if you look at the structure of the cerebrum, you see that it's divided into 2 halves, or 2 cerebral hemispheres. It's divided by a long groove called a fissure. We use the term fissure in geology as well to kind of describe kind of a crack in rock. And so that's the longitudinal fissure. And then we have what we call sulci, or an individual sulcus, as dividing the temporal lobe from your frontal and parietal. That's your lateral sulcus, or you have the central sulcus dividing your frontal from your parietal. I like to think of like sulking your eyebrows forms kind of a shallow groove, and that's how I remember what a sulcus is. These, between a sulcus, or between sulci, this region or folding of the brain would be called a gyrus. And I think of like a gyro, kind of, a lot of times people pronounce them gyro because of how they're spelled. I think of a folded euro, kind of looking like a fold of the brain. That might be a little bit of a stretch. Anyway, so these are some landmarks in the brain that you want to try to find. Maybe not as pronounced in our sheep brain, but definitely be able to find those on a human brain. So, all of our higher functionings happen in our cerebrum, initiating muscle movement, our memory, our reasoning, intelligence, personality, everything that makes us human, really. And so there are 3 kind of functional areas in the brain. We have motor areas that are involved with initiating muscle movement, sensory areas that take incoming information in from our senses, and then, as I mentioned before, these association areas that help us analyze or interpret impulses from our world. So our primary motor area is in the primary motor cortex here in the red. That's going to initiate movement to the skeletal muscles. We also have a region of the brain called the Broca's area that is involved in speech production. And I usually have somebody do like a 1-minute speech about boca burgers, because boca is the Spanish word for mouth, and Broca sounds an awful lot like boca, and both of them have to do with the mouth. or speech anyway, coming from the mouth. So that's kind of my little memory tool for how I remember Broca's area, but it's probably more likely you're going to see it being renamed the motor speech area because that implies a little bit more about what it does rather than the term Broca. You also have a particular area just for moving the eye. You could imagine you need a lot of neurons for that because there's a lot of fine motor movement happening in your eye. So you're going to be making a map of the different areas of the brain, but you're going to do it on a swim cap. So we'll look at this a little bit more another time. Again, sensory areas are going to be interpreting all of our sensations. So our skin, visual information, hearing, taste, and smell, those are all things you're going to want to include on your map, on your brain map. I like to show the sensory homunculus. This is to show kind of how much of your cerebral cortex or how much of your cerebrum is dedicated to each region of your body. You can see that you have a lot of neurons designated for information about your fingers because you're interpreting a lot of your world that way. Also through your lips, especially as an infant when you're trying to nurse and find your first source of food. Plus, of course, vision and smell are right up there. But most of our trunk and body doesn't have a whole lot of information. Your tongue is interesting because you've probably felt like a bump on your tongue that just felt huge in your mind. But when you look at it, it's actually quite small. All right, so we mentioned association areas. Some other things that they can control are reasoning and problem solving, the judgment, emotions, verbalizing ideas, storing memories, thought processing, recognizing things. They say that there's like a particular neuron in your brain that'll light up if you recognize Jennifer Aniston. Kind of funny story. You can look into that one. Oops. This did not pop up quite right. So basically, some additional structures of the cerebrum. Let me just shrink this down here real quick and then we can see this a little bit better. I wanted to show this because this is showing the corpus callosum here, but obviously I did not make it quite large enough. This is the massive span of tissue in your brain that is white matter, and it's allowing your two hemispheres to communicate with each other. So you've probably heard about your left side of your brain controlling the right side of your body, and this is true. Sometimes people with severe seizures on one side of their brain can have procedures done to cut portions of the corpus callosum to kind of help control those seizures. All right, so you're going to hear the term cerebral cortex. I've already said it once. We kind of think of this as the bark of the brain. This is the outermost, this dark purple region. And you can see it's all folded up because anytime we see folding in the body, that usually is a way for the body to increase the amount of surface area. And in this case, this surface area are for the cell bodies of those neurons, which is why it stains darker. This is where about 75% of the cell bodies in our nervous system are. And we've increased its surface area about 3 times with all this folding. So some of the things that different sides of the brain control a little bit more so than the other side. Left brain, you see these things listed here. Language, I always remember language and left brain. Right brain is more what you hear of and about art and creativity. However, all of us use both sides of our brain, regardless of what things we're really strong in. But we use this term lateralization to refer to kind of the unequal functions in our hemispheres. Language, I think, is probably one of the most dominant one, being left-brained. All right, so also in your brain you have these ventricles, which are basically holding places for the cerebral spinal fluid. There are 4 of them, and the lateral ventricles are the first and second of your ventricles. The third one is kind of in this middle brain, like midbrain region. And then your 4th one is down here off of your cerebellum. I find that these are really hard to kind of recognize in the lab because they're not always cut as smoothly. But these are all continuous with fluid that's around the brain and down into the spinal cord. They call this the central canal. You need this fluid because it helps to keep your brain floating, because the weight of your own brain would crush a lot of the neurons in your brain. And so that's why it's kind of found in this area. Also helps it to float underneath this subarachnoid space, which we'll talk about what that is in a second. So not only does it protect the brain by allowing cushioning and floating, but it also provides some nutrients. We get cerebrospinal fluid from blood plasma. We have about a half a cup of it, and we replace it every 8 hours or so. And this shows kind of the map at which it circulates. So it's made here in the choroid plexus. That's a structure you're going to look for in the lab. It's very vascular, meaning it has a lot of blood vessels, because cerebrospinal fluid is basically made from blood plasma. When you look for this, I find that it's easiest to kind of open up this chamber here, these ventricles, and look in the floor of the ventricle. Sometimes it kind of seems like it's up on the roof, but look for a little black matter inside and pull that out. That's your choroid plexus. How you're going to remember that term, I don't know. I always think of choroid pants, and that connection doesn't really work for most people. So this is a disease that can be caused by improper circulation of your cerebral spinal fluid. And in a baby's head, because the skull is not fused, it enlarges the head. We call this hydrocephalus, because water on the brain. If this were to happen in an adult, because your brain can't expand, it's going to cause brain damage and be a really severe issue. But doctors can put in a shunt to kind of divert the fluid buildup in your brain. So this is kind of just showing us pushing the brain outward. All right, so what are these meninges? Well, if you've heard of meningitis, that is infection of the meninges. These are protective membranes that line between the cranial bones and the soft tissues or the brain tissue of the central nervous system. So you have 3 of them. You have the dura mater, which is your tough mother. You have your arachnoid mater that looks kind of spidery, hence arachnoid. That was easier to remember when everybody knew what the movie Arachnophobia was about. And pia mater is your delicate mother. That one looks like a layer of saran wrap on the surface of the brain. Really, really thin saran wrap. The tough mother is like a thick layer of wax paper, only a softer form of wax paper. So you'll definitely see these meninges in our brain dissection. This is just showing another one here. Arachnoid matter is a little bit harder to recognize in the lab, but definitely you can see how the pia mater makes it kind of shiny on the surface. Notice the arrangement of gray and white matter in the spinal cord being opposite to the brain's, to the cerebrum, something we've talked about before. All right, we are going to talk about the rest of the brain, like the hypothalamus here. Notice the hypothalamus really doesn't look like a separate structure. It's kind of just a region of the brain where there's certain cell bodies that control things. For example, it controls the pituitary gland and release of hormones from the pituitary gland. It's also your body's major thermostat. So we'll talk a little bit more about that here. Your thalamus, the main thing you want to know about that is it's kind of sorting out information for your brain. It detects what things are kind of pleasant versus unpleasant, and kind of sends that information to the particular region of the brain. So for example, whether you're paying attention to information, the thalamus kind of helps sort that information out. As I mentioned before, the hypothalamus has a lot of roles with your endocrine system and nervous system, including body temperature, heart rate and blood pressure, water and electrolyte balance, hunger and body weight, movement and secretions of your digestive tract, your growth and reproduction, part of this because of hormones that they produce, and they play a role a little bit in sleep and wakefulness as well. All right, your brainstem is made up of your midbrain, which contains one thing that we're going to be looking for here is the corpora quadrigemina, or the body of the 4 twins, which I'll just point out to you in lab. The pons controls your breathing, particularly the rate and depth of breathing. Medulla is your heart rate. blood pressure, respiration, swallowing and vomiting. And then there's